Stories of multi-million-dollar takeovers, fan revolts against owners, and sudden franchise relocations are common around the globe's big sporting leagues. Here in Australia, however, Russian billionaires and Saudi princes are absent from the sporting landscape. So just who does own our AFL clubs? To begin, it's important to establish what ownership of an AFL club looks like. The clubs themselves are set up as limited companies, run by a board of directors, which is usually somewhere between 6 and 10 people. The board is responsible for running the club and appointing its executives, such as the CEO. The board will also elect one of these directors to be its chairperson. This is the leader of the club, often known as the president, and it is important to remember that the president does not own the club. In order to control the club, you must control who sits on its board, and it's in this way that the concept of club ownership is determined. The most common setup for AFL clubs is to be owned by their members. The club's paying members elect the directors to the board at an annual general meeting, giving fans the final say in how their team is run. This is the system currently used by all Victorian teams, although there is some variation in this. For example, the Richmond board has 9 directors. The members elect the first 6, who then appoint the remaining 3, while the Collingwood board consists of 7 directors, who are all elected by the members. The Victorian landscape wasn't always this uniform. Facing bankruptcy in the late 80s, North Melbourne became a shareholder-owned club in 1987. They sold 3 million shares at $1 each, and wiped off the club's $1 million debt. This saved the club, but brought with it further issues, such as an attempted hostile takeover by Carlton. After the club rejected the AFL's plan to move them to the Gold Coast in 2007, the shareholders gave up their interest, and control was returned to the members. The only club outside of Victoria to be member-owned is Brisbane. Originally, the Brisbane Bears began life as a privately owned company, when the AFL sold an expansion licence to a consortium fronted by actor Paul Cronin and financed by controversial businessman Christopher Skase. After Skase's empire collapsed in 1989, the club was reacquired by the AFL and sold a second time to businessman Ruben Pellerman, who failed to turn the struggling team around and gave it over to member control in 1992, a status the Brisbane Lions still retained after the Bears merged with Fitzroy. The great advantage of member ownership is that it means the main focus of clubs will remain on winning games. The members don't receive any of the club's profits, which are invested back into the club itself. Instead, their main priority is to see teams win games, and they will vote with this in mind, meaning that from a financial standpoint, members will be happy so long as the club is sound enough to continue to exist. The Bears weren't the only club to flirt with private ownership during this time. When South Melbourne became the Sydney Swans in 1985, the VFL sold the licence to Jeffrey Edelstein, who soon realised the financial mountain ahead of him and gave control back to the VFL in 1986. They then sold the team again in 1988 to a consortium led by media personality Mike Willesee. However, the 93 Swans were in trouble again. In response, the AFL assumed control of the club once more, and have continued to run it ever since. The AFL now directly appoints 7 of the 9 board members, while Sydney members have the chance to vote on the remaining 2. Since requiring the Swans, the AFL has been strongly opposed to private ownership of its clubs. There are, however, 2 clubs who still fall under the private banner. The Western Australian teams are both owned by the Western Australian Football Commission, the governing body that runs the WAFL. West Coast entered the VFL in 1987, with their licence under the control of Indian Pacific Limited, a private company set up for the sole purpose of running the Eagles. However, after 3 seasons, they had lost $13 million and were facing calls for VFL's Perth experiment to be abandoned. The WAFC bought a controlling share of Indian Pacific, giving them the control over the Eagles they maintain today. The Commission appoints the club's board, and also takes a portion of the profits, which are then used to grow the game throughout WA. By the time Fremantle entered the league in 1995, the AFL were wary of selling off another new club to private investors, and the club has been under control of the WAFC since the beginning, with a board of directors managing the club on the Commission's behalf. In 2019, the WAFC assumed total control of the clubs, as all 8 of its directors are now appointed by the Commission. Prior to this, the Dockers members had been given the power to elect 2 of these. The WA model was also employed in South Australia, and up until 2014, the SANFL had owned the licences for the state's 2 teams. However, in 2014, these licences were bought by the clubs themselves. In the case of Adelaide, this cost $11.3 million, while Port Adelaide cost just under $7 million. These moves were branded as the clubs gaining their independence, but essentially, it just transferred control from the State League to the AFL. Both Power and Crows members only have the ability to elect 2 members to their club's boards, meaning both Adelaide and the Power join the Swans on the list of the AFL-owned clubs. What then of the competition's newest clubs? As might be expected, both Gold Coast and Greater Western Sydney have boards that are entirely controlled by the AFL. They are actually set up as member-run clubs, although the AFL is the only member with voting rights. This will continue until such time as either club reaches their transition key performance indicators and can become member-owned. In Gold Coast's constitution, these KPIs are given as 3 consecutive years of profit without special AFL funding, ownership of $5 million in assets, and any other KPIs agreed upon between the club and the AFL. With the Giants coming off a net loss in 2019 despite making the grand final, and the Suns still receiving AFL handouts, these milestones still appear to be a while away. In summary, 11 of the AFL's 18 clubs are owned by their members. 2 are owned by the Western Australian Football Commission, and the remaining 5 by the AFL itself. The AFL is in turn run by the AFL Commission, and is set up as a not-for-profit organisation. The clubs do have some influence over the league, although this is quite limited.